Welcome once again to another episode of Ridge Talk, and I think it was probably a couple of weeks ago now by the time this is being published and going out there. We started talking about a upcoming message series that we're going to be doing on the topic of counter formation. And really the idea behind it is that spiritual formation, discipleship, we're all being formed, whether we realize it or not. And we really just wanted to provide a little bit of insight, a little bit of an introduction into, hey, what are some of the major ways that we are being formed today in our culture that we may not even be aware of? Why is that important? Why do we need to address it? And how do we address it? What are the next steps? So I think this first one that we are going to talk about today, I'm going to turn over to Daniel here. He probably has thought a little bit more about this, but it's the idea, or it's this, the general foundation of it is called expressive individualism. And, it's a term that, scholars, professors might use that term, authors might use it. It's not one that you're going to see or hear in the news media or anything like that. But that's the foundation. So just, at that basic level, Daniel, how would you define expressive individualism?
I'm so glad you asked me that, Justin. Okay, so here's the deal. I think part of this idea is, and again, you just did such a good job of reminding us this. The idea is we want to talk as a church about formation. What does discipleship look like? But to do that, we also have to recognize none of that happens in a vacuum, and that we're already being formed by something. We talked about that in our last episode. And so the idea is, in this counterformation series, is to really begin identifying what are the really big narratives, or you might even say meta narratives, like the really big narratives that are influencing everything. You just pointed to expressive individualism. I'm going to do something we agreed not to do, and I'm going to go back
when this happens.
And I'm just going to do one quick thing. The two that we've kind of talked about together are the idea of expressive individualism and also secular humanism. And I'm only going to talk about that for like half a second. But the idea of secular humanism is this idea that there's this big grand experiment that's been taking place on the world stage for the last 100 years. Secular humanism is just the idea of we can separate God and religion from everything else that we're doing, so that mankind, everything we do is just centered on us. And that's really the big idea. Now I'm moving away from it, I promise. But we'll
talk about that more in the future.
Maybe. But the point is, that ideology of let's separate God out, we're a secular society where mankind is the measure, that has led now to what people are referring to as expressive individualism, which is just this idea that not just mankind or humans are the center of the universe, but I as an individual am the center of that universe. And so you've got guys like Charles Taylor in A Secular Age who are kind of working through some of this stuff. You've got, what's the other guy, Carl Trueman, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Those are big, thick sociological and psychological and whatever philosophical books. All philosophicals. They're all of those working together, but they're all getting at this idea that as a society, even globally, but definitely in Western society, there's been this huge push toward making the individual and our minds and our thoughts and how we want to express ourselves the center of all things. And so as we began looking at a lot of the narratives, I think I think there's some admirable things about focusing on the individual, but there's also some dangers. I mean, it can get very insidious quickly. And so many of the narratives and the messages that we hear stem from that right now. That is one of the most prominent prevailing winds of our society right now. And so that's a big narrative that we want to talk about.
And to be clear, like I would just jump in and say, this is a big thing in our culture. It's not brand new. Like this goes back, depending on which of these guys that you're talking about you want to read, it goes back to at least the Enlightenment. So it goes back at least late 18th century, 1700s.
Most of them place the beginning of this idea in the Enlightenment. That's right.
Yeah, but what's happened is it's become ubiquitous. It's become everywhere. It's become unavoidable to the point where it's become the air that we breathe.
Yeah. And a lot of the way it's communicated is so subtle
Yes,
you don't even realize that you're receiving it.
Talking about the air you breathe, you had like a good analogy about like fish or something.
Yeah, I've used this in a sermon a couple times, but I'll repeat it again. This is an illustration from a guy named David Foster Wallace, and he's talking in a college commencement speech about how the things in the world that are the hardest for us to name are what's the word I'm looking for? They're often the hardest to see. And so his illustration is, imagine there's two fish swimming along. Imagine they're kind of young guys, young fish kind of swimming along, talking to each other, whatever. And an older fish, kind of like an old guy, so to speak. An older fish swims along and he says, "Good morning, boys. How's the water?" And they kind of, they finish, they have their little conversation, pleasantries, and kind of keep swimming along. And they get a little farther down, out of earshot of the older fish. And one of the two younger fish looks at the other and says, "Hey, what's water?"
What's water?
Just to illustrate that, like, it's obviously for a fish, you can't exist without water. It's everything. It's the whole environment that they exist in. And yet it can go unseen, unspoken, unexpressed to a point where you don't even realize it's what we're breathing in.
It's the water you breathe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. So I don't know. Do we want to talk about like some of the ways these messages come across to us, or what the messages are?
Yeah, I think we totally could. One of the things I wanted to say quickly, because expressive individualism can get a bad rap, and rightly so. However, there are some admirable qualities about putting some focus on the individual. The majority of human history didn't care at all about the individual. The individuals were routinely neglected. The well-being of an individual was always looked at as inferior to the well-being of the group.
Yeah,
and that's the majority of human history.
Having self-care, having personal boundaries, that kind of thing. Like that's
nobody cared about that. It was how are you? That's right.
I'm saying today those things are good. Like you want to have self-care. You want to,
or even in the most extreme of cases, societies that were set up with varying levels of power.
That's right.
To where if you were just at some lower level, it wasn't even as if like it was a marginal like indifference. It was like you don't have life a voice. Does not matter.
Yeah. You do not have a voice. You do not matter. That's right.
You are expendable for the rich and powerful or whatever.
That's exactly right.
So there are some positives, but then like on the flip side of the coin, like some of the ways this theme comes across is like in the topic of freedom. Mm-hmm. You have the right to do whatever it is you want to do, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. That's the concept of freedom that comes across in our culture today. Is hey, you do you do whatever you want. As long as it's not hurting anybody else, it's completely okay. That's one of the ways that this comes across.
Yeah. There's a lot of different messages that would come across. So again, I think some of the danger. So what's been described often as expressive individualism now, it's right. It is number one. It's predicated on the belief that all humans are good. Mm-hmm. That people are just inherently good, and so if you throw enough resources at whatever and give enough care and eventually they will thrive. But a flip side of that is, well, it's not even a flip side. Organizations, institutions, things like the church, things like educational institutions, things like the nuclear family, they're viewed as suspicious at best and evil at worst. And so there is this idea of I as the individual, I determine my fate. I determine every aspect of my life. I can curate everything.
I determine what's good, what's not good.
So it can go as deep as morality. Mm-hmm. It could be as simple as I curate my own playlist, right? Like I determine my what's the best music and what I like to listen to. So everything's curated. But there's this idea that institutions and organizations must be either totally destroyed and brought down, or at least, what's the word I'm looking for? That there's a stripping away of it. Deconstruction is the big buzzword. That there's a level of it must either be deconstructed and rebuilt, but no one knows to what. Right? It's whatever the individual thinks it should be rebuilt as, or it just needs to be destroyed altogether. And so those are some kind of big a rough framework of what expressive individualism is. It says that I am the measure and what I believe is the most important thing, and I must express that in order to be truly authentic. And if you totally divorce that from anything external, whether a group or a higher power or an agreed upon social order, chaos is what ultimately can ensue.
Yeah.
And so there's some real dangers to it as well. But you were mentioning messages. I think there's, again, you talk about, Luch, talk about this is like the air we breathe. It's just ubiquitous. I think there's so much in our world that reinforces this. What are some messages you guys have heard that kind of reinforce this idea?
I've got one. I listen to a number of podcasts, and I've noticed in the past year or two that more and more of the ads on the podcasts are for therapy, for counseling. And, that's a good thing. Like I'm for it. I occasionally even see a counselor myself. So I'm for it, but it is interesting the way that the ads work. A lot of times the sell is something to the effect of the catch line in one of them I've heard several times recently is something like, give yourself the gift of the better you, or something like that.
Boy, that's just all you, right?
And that's what keeps striking me is I'm like, oh, you. So that's who it's about. It's about me. That's perfect. Like that, I want that because that sounds good.
It's like the Parks and Rec. Treat yourself.
Yeah. So that's one that I've definitely like. Again, it's an interesting thing because in all these in this conversation, there's a goodness to it. There's a goodness to counseling and therapy and dealing with hurts of the past or just dealing with stress of today and kind of moving forward beyond some things. There's also, you can get stuck in yourself or get stuck in the mud when you kind of overemphasize these things. So that's one that I keep bumping up into, and every time I hear it, I'm like, again, two sides here. But it's worth exploring. So,
well, let me get out my iPhone or my iPad.
Yeah.
This podcast is not sponsored by Apple.
Right, but that is, I would say, probably the most common way that we're all touched by this in an unseen way is through advertising. Like we know more and more as we learn about how the internet targets you with ads and collects data and how that data is used to create ideas of what you as a consumer might be drawn toward. That is like everybody talks about the algorithm, like as if it's almost this like living entity that people have created in their minds that controls things. But it is this idea that advertising has shaped so much of the world that we live in, which is really meant to sort of prey on the worst parts of human impulse to try and mold you and shape you into a customer that would pursue purchasing certain things. And I would say that's one way that we sort of semi-consciously or even unconsciously experience that. But even, like I said, the joke that I made, like our iPhone and our iPad and all that, like those are explicit ways that just reinforce that things that are about you or custom to you, or we love things like bespoke is a word that's around a lot, which means it's like a one-off thing created just for you to within your parameters.
I wondered what that meant.
all of those types of things that really just reinforce at the most benign, it's kind of like our preferences, and then at the most insidious, it is descending into tribalism where we reject and maybe even persecute other people who don't think like us as a result. And I think that's kind of where we see that play out across our culture.
Well, you're bringing up such a good thing to bring up there, though, Sean, because the reality is no man is an island, right? As you know, we can't be purely individuals separated from a group, and I think we all recognize that we all have to exist in part of a community. The idea behind this expressive individualism, though, is like where I don't know if there's an idea behind it, but it can seem like the focus of all meaning is within the mind of the individual, within the personal will of the individual, and it's been divorced from the community. So for so much of human history, meaning and purpose and identity have all been received from the community that we're in, right? And so now with expressive individualism, purpose is something that I define. My wants and desires and what makes me happy is what I design. And then my identity. I mean, this really gets into who I am as a person, and literally, like, I don't have to accept the societal constructs of gender or even sex. Now, these are the things that are on the table with expressive individualism. What's interesting to me about that is you mentioned the word tribalism or tribes. And the thing is, this is the first time in human society when you can choose your tribe. Mm-hmm. You can curate your own tribe. You're not just, well, I was born this is what I am. It's, this is who I desire to be and say that I am. And so this is my tribe now.
Yeah, I mean, even throughout most of human history, the family you were born into, just from a like geographic perspective, you were probably going to live in and around the community that you were born into.
Yep.
Now we can physically move, but then there's this online world where we can exist and not even have to be geographically located with other people in our tribe. And it's such an interesting element
literally
to it.
Their face on the other side of the world in real time.
And that's sort of the interesting thing. We talked about some of these things are born of like good intentions and good backgrounds. Like Christianity was one of the first movements, if not the first movement, to introduce the idea of the value of an individual and individual rights, at recognizing that people and individuals are created in the image of God and therefore have inherent value.
That's exactly right.
The Christian Revolution was that became something that existed. And so very good things like hospital systems and so many things that cared for individuals were born out of the truth that individuals do matter, and that the world existed for a very long time where individuals not only didn't matter, but were oppressed and were used for the sake of power. And that still exists today. That's one of the big, things involved in culture still. But it started with this good intention of, hey, individuals have value, they matter, they have rights. And we can see how with everything, pendulums can swing, emphases can swing. And I would say that what we're kind of getting at is something that started out good with individuals having value and asserting themselves and mattering in the grand scheme of things, that what has happened is now we've almost pushed away the community that also matters and has value and gives us purpose and meaning and a place and identity. And we've sort of pushed that aside and elevated the individual beyond where the individual was ever created to exist.
Right, and the result
now it's out of balance in that
chaos,
way.
Ultimately. Well, okay, so listen, we got to get moving here, but I think that I'd like to ask this question. With regard to the church, so there's a couple of ideas that we've really put in here, because the church, that could have been a community, or tribalism is even something that's has taken place there. But where do you see in the past couple of years or decades, where have we seen the church as a whole in America, at least in the West or in America, where have we seen it focus on the individual to the detriment of the community? Or another way of saying that, something you brought up just a minute ago, Sean, was the algorithms that are always viewing us as consumers. And so we're going to do things. We're going to view you as a consumer, and then we're going to operate in such a way that brings you back, that'll let you buy the product in a sense. I don't want to overstep and say the church has definitely done that in the last 20 to 50 years. But the church has definitely done that in the last 20 to 50 years. And so I just want to ask, where are you guys seeing that happening? And what do you think are the implications of this for discipleship in the 21st century?
So much there.
I'd say at the most surface level, I don't want to call it benign because I don't think that it is, but simply the idea of people moving from church to church based on preference. If the way that they're doing music or the lights, or especially if people were originally rooted in a community and then because of preference sever themselves from that community and kind of either move on or don't go anywhere at all. I'm not talking about like if there's real like abuse or oppression or things that happen, but things that are like, oh, I just don't like the preaching anymore, or I'm not being fed is a common thing that you could hear people
They're not preaching
say,
strong enough about this topic.
or the music is not to my preference. We're not doing hymns anymore, or we're doing songs that aren't great. The lights are too bright, the music's too loud, or it's not bright or loud enough, or whatever any of those things might be, or the programs that this church has to offer don't suit what I want. Then people sever themselves from community and move on somewhere else, maybe, or just are now separated from any community. I think we've seen how detrimental that's been. One of the ways that we see that borne out is on this side of COVID. COVID shut down our churches and affected our ability to meet in person. Mm-hmm. And on this side of things, most churches nationwide average, maybe if they're lucky, got 70% of their kind of people back. Yep. And I think what that reveals is that when people were sort of like given an out to sort of reevaluate things, either based on preference or whatever, that it just like they just had the out, and it wasn't that their ties to a community were not strong enough to bring them back. It must have been some mix of these other things that was keeping them there in the first place. Because what it reveals is like their attendance before all of that wasn't about being deeply tied into a community, or else they probably would have made it through all of that and still be deeply tied to the community. So now we have to ask the question, well, what was it that was keeping people coming through the doors? And odds are it wasn't something that was really deepening something in their life. And so I think that's detrimental.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's some things that, I don't want to use the word detrimental for, but, like these are things that I think we have noticed and have started taking steps in a more positive direction to recognize, hey, we do, we function as the family of God here, not in a completely individualistic culture. So, one example, leading up to just a few months ago when we had communion, hey, this is your time. You pray, you confess, you remember, you do this, you take the elements when you want to take them. And after enough time has passed, we're just going to continue on with the service. And we've transitioned into a time of, hey, this is a family meal, and we're all going to take it together. Spend time in reflection and in remembrance and in prayer and in confession. But then together, we're going to participate in this.
So what you're saying, that's
one thing that we've done, I think.
Of counter formation.
Yeah.
That's an example of.
And like another one is, I think that churches, and this is just evangelical churches in general. We tell people, hey, read your Bible, spend time in prayer, do these things, but in a typical weekend service, there's somebody on stage reading the Bible out loud. There's somebody on stage praying. Mm-hmm. We tell people, hey, you go do this on your own now. But we don't always do it as a group together. And one of the steps that we've taken too over the past year is just bringing people together for specific prayer gatherings to say, hey, we're going to circle up, and it's not just going to be the pastors or ministry leaders. Like, we're all going to take opportunities to pray for one another, because we are the body of Christ. We are the family of God here, and we're going to do this together as a family.
And the idea is not that we would want to ever. It's not that we're trying to focus on the individual over the group or the group over the individual. We recognize both of those things. The point is that we're not making decisions based on solely one or solely the other, but it's the decisions that we're making are rooted in something deeper and something more ancient. We're not thinking about changing the way things are to service to make sure the individual is entertained and really their ego is stroked. And it's not just it's only for the good of the group, but it's, hey, this is something that the church has been doing for thousands of years, and and maybe even stopped doing so that it could be more palatable for the individual. And we're like, maybe that wasn't a good move. Maybe we want to bring some of these things back.
Yeah.
As a way to support the family of God, being mindful of the individual. Having both of those things in balance, I think, is really important.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I'll just say too, like even this kind of conversation, I don't think we're having this conversation because we feel like we're experts.
No.
Or because we feel like, well, we work for a church, so it's our job to figure this out and we'll tell you guys the best. Like I don't think that, to me that's not it. Like we're saying we're learning in this environment. We're expressing some of what we're learning. We're even able to kind of double back around and say, hey, this is why we did this thing different in a service, or why we had this kind of a service, or different things. And so, I don't know. In sitting here listening, I'm thinking about some of the things that I've experienced here at Southridge, some of the things that we've started doing at Ridgeview. That we're not perfect. We're not trying to be perfect. We are trying to, address things that we see and be like, well, how can we push back on that so as to push you toward Christ, invite you into that more.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I just want to make sure that the tone is right on that. That we're learning, we're figuring things out, and as we're exploring things of like, if there's things like you talk about change the way that communion was communicated. Mm-hmm. Well, when we change things, there are going to be times when, I know there was a question specifically about communion that was addressed on a Ridge Talk, I don't know, 15 episodes ago or something like that. Maybe it was more recent than that. But that, I think that's a good question, because it's going to create question. Hey, why are you saying it this way and not that way? Mm-hmm. Well, in some of that, because we're trying to address something over here, and we're trying to invite you into something that we think is right. So we may not get it right all the time.
That's right.
We may, there might be times when we're like, we go back and we reevaluate, or somebody comes to one of us and is like, hey, we sure about this? And it's like, well, here's the thinking behind it. Is that what we did? And there might be times it's like, well, no, that's not quite it. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there to say, there are ways that we're thinking through. We're kind of looking at these big ideas, these big formational topics, and then being like, all right, well, how can we push back on that? And it might take a while to institute some of those things, and we might not always get it quite right, but sure. These are just things we're exploring.
I don't know if you had anything more you wanted to share, Daniel. This is we're really prepping a message series on counter formation that isn't going to occur until April. Yeah, after Easter. So we're going to be getting more into this. So, these themes that we've brought up today, like the idea of freedom. I can do whatever I want to do. You do you. Treat yourself.
Sounds good.
I just thought of that one. There's other messages out there. Be thinking about that. Just be paying attention to culture. What are the messages that you're hearing in culture through news media and social media, the entity algorithm that's out there?
And do those things point you to Jesus? Do they
That's right.
make you look more like Jesus?
Are you aware of the things that are forming you?
Yeah, the idea of counter formation is formation is our attempt at becoming more like Christ. The need to counterform is these other influences that may either get in the way of our formation into Christ-likeness or may distort our formation into Christ-likeness. And so it takes, and it's not just a passive resistance. Some of it is an active resistance to make sure that these things aren't distorting how we're being formed into the image of Christ.
Yeah, and a lot of it really just takes a lot of reflection, meditation, prayer to be like, am I following Jesus the way that he's leading me? Am I putting my trust in him? Am I recognizing what's trying to form me and saying, no, I'm going to do this instead? There's an example that's coming to mind while we're wrapping this up. There was a time in Jesus's ministry when he goes off to the side to pray in the morning, and his disciples come to him, and he's like, they're like, Jesus, where you been? The people all want to see you. We're in this town, all the people want to see you. And Jesus stands up and he says, no, we're going to go over there to that other town instead. That's what God's called me here for. And wow, talk about disappointing a whole lot of people. There was a community that was just wanting to see Jesus, and there he was in prayer with his Heavenly Father, and he's like, I've spent the time that I'm supposed to spend here. I'm supposed to go over there now. And that idea of counter formation, I think we can see that in that example of, culture is saying, hey, this is what you should be doing. This is what should be important to you. This is what we want you to do. This is what's going to, make us like you more or whatever. And when we're listening to our Heavenly Father, we might be like, nope, I don't think so. I think I'm supposed to go do something else instead. So just something to be aware of. So yeah, we're going to get into much more of this series. In the future, we'll probably be talking about some other ideas as to some of the things that are forming us and how we can enter into a mindset and a spirit of counter formation in the weeks to come. But until then, as always, feel free to like and subscribe, follow the podcast here. And if you have any other questions, or if you just want to share how you see, this topic of, what is it?
Expressive individualism.
Expressive individualism. Thank you, Sean. In our culture today, you can feel free to write to us and let us know. And again, if you have any questions about anything else, feel free to reach out to us anytime. We look forward to catching up with you again soon.